The Trump administration's emergency request to the Supreme Court to lift a judicial block on deploying Federalized National Guard troops in the Chicago area represents a critical escalation in the ongoing legal and political conflict between the federal executive branch and state authorities, primarily Democratic governors, over the use of military forces on U.S. soil. This entire episode centers on presidential power, federalism, and the proper legal thresholds for domestic military deployment, setting up a significant constitutional clash. Summary and analysis of the issue. The core of the dispute involves the Trump administration's effort to deploy Federalized National Guard troops, drawn from Illinois and Texas, to the Chicago area, ostensibly to protect federal property and personnel amidst protests against its immigration enforcement actions. This move was made over the strenuous objection of Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, along with state officials, filed a lawsuit to block the deployment. Lower courts have consistently ruled against the administration's immediate deployment. A U.S. district judge initially blocked the deployment, finding no substantial evidence of a danger of rebellion in Illinois sufficient to justify the use of troops. The judge also criticized the administration's filings for a troubling trend of equating peaceful protest with riots. The 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld this block, stating that the administration was unlikely to prove the necessity of the Guard and that political opposition is not rebellion. The appeals court panel further suggested the action likely violated the U.S. Constitution's 10th Amendment, which reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states. The administration's subsequent emergency appeal to the Supreme Court argues that the lower court decisions are controlling the military chain of command and judicially micromanaging the exercise of the president's commander-in-chief powers. This frames the issue as a defense of the executive's expansive authority against judicial overreach. Reasons and consequences of the legal battle. Reasons for the conflict. Executive authority versus state sovereignty, federalism. The primary legal conflict pits the president's constitutional and statutory authority, particularly Title 10 U.S.C. provisions for federalizing the Guard to execute federal law or suppress insurrections, against the state's constitutional control over its militia, the National Guard when not federalized, and the 10th Amendment. Contested factual basis. State and local officials, and subsequently the courts, found the administration's claim of an insurrection or rebellion to be lacking in credible evidence, suggesting regular federal law enforcement was capable of handling the situation. Political motivation. The deployment is viewed by critics as a political power grab targeting Democratic-led blue cities and a way to escalate federal intervention in local affairs, specifically tied to controversial immigration crackdowns. The Posse Comitatus Act, PCA. Conflict. The Federalized National Guard falls under the constraints of the PCA, which generally prohibits the use of the military for civilian law enforcement. The administration used federalization powers to place troops for protection of federal property, skirting a full Insurrection Act invocation which would temporarily suspend the PCA, but still faces scrutiny over the legality and necessity of the deployment itself. Consequences. Erosion of public trust. Deploying military-style forces domestically, especially against the wishes of local leadership, tends to intimidate communities, undermine public safety efforts, and erode public trust in both the military and federal government. Legal precedent. The Supreme Court's eventual decision will be crucial in setting legal limits on presidential power to unilaterally deploy military assets domestically, especially over state objections and without formally invoking the Insurrection Act, thereby redefining the balance of power between the states and the federal executive. Resource diversion and cost. The deployment diverts National Guard resources and personnel, incurring significant taxpayer costs, which critics argue are unnecessary given the functional capacity of existing law enforcement. Prediction and solutions. Prediction. Given the current judicial status, the prediction leans toward the courts maintaining a restrictive view of presidential power in this specific context. 1. Supreme Court action. The Supreme Court may decline to immediately lift the deployment block or may remand the case for further proceedings. Lower courts, unanimous findings that the administration failed to show sufficient evidence of a rebellion or that regular forces were overwhelmed make the high bar for emergency Supreme Court intervention difficult to clear. 2. Focus on evidence and necessity. Future court rulings will likely continue to focus heavily on the factual necessity of the military deployment, requiring the executive branch to provide credible, concrete evidence of a failure of civil authority that warrants military intervention. 3. Future Insurrection Act threat. The legal battle signals a growing willingness by some administrations to stretch the limits of Title X authority and potentially even threaten to invoke the Insurrection Act. Future conflicts are likely unless the statutory framework is clarified. Solutions. The primary long-term solutions require legislative action by Congress to clarify the ambiguous and archaic statutes at the center of this constitutional conflict, particularly the Insurrection Act. Clarify the Insurrection Act and Title X. Use. Congress must modernize and narrow the criteria for invoking the Insurrection Act, specifying what constitutes an insurrection, or rebellion, that makes enforcing laws by ordinary course of judicial proceedings impracticable. This would reduce a president's unilateral power and force clearer legal justifications. Limit duration and mandate. Congressional review. New legislation should impose a finite time limit, e.g., 30 to 45 days, on the use of military forces under such authority, coupled with a mandatory mechanism for streamlined congressional review or an emergency termination vote. Strengthen anti-commandeering principles. While federalized, the Guard is subject to federal command, but Congress could still legislatively reinforce the 10th Amendment by further restricting the use of Federalized National Guard troops for missions that are primarily the responsibility of state and local law enforcement, thereby supporting the principles of federalism and executive restraint.